In today's video, we're gonna go from this to this. Let's go. Okay, today we're gonna try out a coloring method that's used by many manga artists. It looks great, and more importantly, it's supposed to be a fast process, which is something I'm looking for. This method relies on clipping masks, lasso tools, bucket fills, airbrush tools, and layer blending modes, which means this will work in Clip Studio Paint, Photoshop, and Procreate. So let's get to it. To start, I have my illustration already set up and ready to go. I have my clean line art and I have all my elements of my illustrations already flatted out. And then on top of that, I've already sampled some color swatches that I took from other reference and other artwork to help with this illustration. I want to spend just a quick second to talk about how the layers are set up here. So as I mentioned, we have our clean line art, but on top of that, we also have our skin, the gold from the costume, the cape gold, and the costume flats already separated out into separate layers. Now this is going to be really important because we're going to be utilizing the clip to layer tool in the layer panel to help us with our rendering. For this demo, we're just going to focus on the skin area. So we're going to create a new layer on top, and then we're going to hit the clip to layer tool. And you can see that there's this pink bar that shows up to let us know that it's clipping to the layer below, which is great. But what does clipping mean? Essentially what it means is if I grab my brush tool and I were to draw inside the skin area, you can see my line art shows. However, if I were to draw outside, nothing shows. So this allows us to have clean rendering going on with our layers without having to worry about bleeding into other areas of our illustration, which is super useful. And this is part of the reason why this method is a lot faster than working off of a single layer or doing some like traditional digital painting. All right, so let's get to rendering. First, we're going to select our shadow, the color that we've already pre-selected for our shadows. And then we're going to grab the lasso tool. With the lasso tool, we're going to define the area where we want to apply shading. And then again, because we're using that clipping mask, I don't have to be super particular about the edges over here because I know I'm not going to fill anything there. And then rather than grab the fill bucket tool from the left side here, I'm just going to use this handy toolbar that Clip Studio has and just tap the fill button, and there we go. This has been filled. I'm going to select this other area here, fill, and then you just keep going and start selecting the different areas that you want to define as your shadows. So this right here is pretty much what you expect from doing something like cell shading, which is what you see in all forms of animation, Japanese animation, Western animation. They rely on this form of shading because it's really simple and a quick way to define some rendering without getting super detailed. This is a good place to start, and this allows us to understand our light source. It allows us to quickly visualize all the different aspects of our rendering without getting super detailed. And as you can see, because we're using the clipping mask, it does speed up the process quite a bit because I'm not super careful or super worried about bleeding into other areas of my illustration. I can just focus on what's important. Like that, I was able to define the whole areas of my hand, and I just hit fill, and boom. That will probably take me a lot longer to define and select that area. Now, if you're not comfortable with the lasso tool, you can go ahead and just grab a brush and do the exact same thing. Just make sure you're using a hard edge brush, or something like an inking brush, to do just that. Just because we still want to have sort of the hard lines in our shadows, and we're going to work on softening that up and making that look better in just a moment. Okay, great. So that's a good place for us to move on to the next step. We have a very clearly defined light source. And what we want to do at this stage is we want to add some bounce lighting to our rendering. Right now, the cell shading is pretty flat, so we want to add some depth by going ahead and select the lasso tool. And we're going to select some areas within our shadows. And we're going to grab the airbrush tool. Make sure to have the soft subtool selected. And then for the color swatch, we're going to select the transparent color swatch. Now, Photoshop doesn't have the transparent color swatch. And I can't remember if Procreate does. I believe it does. But if it doesn't, no problem. Just make sure you select your eraser tool and you select it to and switch it to the airbrush mode. And you're going to be able to do the exact same thing. So you want to make sure your brush size is fairly large. And then we're just going to gently sweep in some strokes. You can see here that we've sort of created a sort of softer edge to or softer areas within our shadows. And that's because with bounce lighting, you have the light coming in from over her shoulder, the sunlight hitting her face, casting shadows across her face. But then as it hits something else that's around the character, that's going to bounce the lighting back into those shadows, and it's going to create some life within the shadows, which is why you take a look at a lot of like traditional rendering. There's a lot going on in that, and so you really do have to pay attention and study different forms or different types of rendering, because they all sort of tackle that sort of basic idea that you have your single light source, but there's light, even with a single light source, there is light bouncing around and hitting all different aspects of your illustration. So that's just something that you should probably want to, if you're not incorporating that in your illustration as of yet, it's something you should definitely look into studying and learning more about. So I'm just gonna fix up some shadows here. Again, select this. Okay, great. So now that we've done that and we've added some bounce lighting, the next thing we want to do is to take a look at the edges of our rendering. And basically what we want to do here is keep the hard lines where it makes sense, but then soften things up where we want to see a gradual change in the shading or in the rendering. So I'm going to grab the blur tool. I'm going to make sure that it's selected to blur as the subtool. Sorry, the blending tool. I call it the blur tool. This is the blending tool, and make sure it has the subtool blur selected. And then we're going to make sure our brush size is at a decent size, so like 30 or 50 is good. And then what we're going to do is we're going to select the edges that we feel like need to be softened a little. And just bring that out. Now, this is something it's very easy to go overboard with. I do it all the time, and I have to like go back and rework my hard edges. So just be mindful that you don't lose your hard edges, because that sense of contrast, that sense of shape comes with your hard edges. The soft, if everything in your illustration uses sort of soft lines or soft edges, it ends up looking really flat. You do want to incorporate some of those hard lines to make sure that the lighting you're selling the lighting just a lot more with that. Okay, great. So we've added our bounce lighting, we've softened our lines where it made sense. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to add some darkest darks, or adding some more shadows within our shadows. Now, the way that I do this, some artists create a new layer and set a clipping mask on top of that. That's fine if you want to go through that and do that. But I prefer to like minimize how many layers I have in my document. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the lock transparency. And lock transparency works just like the clipping layer, except with the clipping layer, you're working on a new layer and you're clipping to the layer below. Lock transparency makes it so that any pixels, any area in your layer that already has some pixel information, you can paint on top of that. anything that has a transparent pixel, no brush strokes would be applied. So here, I'll do another demonstration to show what that means. So I'll use red. So if I were to draw on her cheek, I have no brush strokes. But if I were to draw in her eye, you can see there's some brush strokes there. Sorry, pick this red to make it more clear. So cheek, nothing. In the eye, I'm able to add some brush strokes, which is exactly what we're looking for in this particular scenario. So let me undo that, and I'm going to sample the color that I've already put together as sort of my shadow within the shadow. And we're going to grab airbrush tool. You can switch between using airbrush tool and a hard edge brush depending on the area that you're working on. So with this nose, I want to use a hard edge tool. And so with this, I'm giving information to the user to let them know, or like the audience to let them know that there are different planes within the shadow area that I'm working with, that we're not just working on one uniform plane. We already sort of described a little bit of that with sort of the bounce lighting to let them know that there's a plane here versus the cheekbone. And now with the darker shadows, we're introducing some more information for our audience to use to understand the planes in our illustrations a little bit more. Next, I'm gonna grab my airbrush tool, and I am going to gently, oop, it's way too big, sorry. Double check the size of your brushes. And then we're just going to brush in some darkest darks to sell sort of the roundness of those shapes. So you'll notice this, like if you ever gone through the exercise of shading a ball, you know that there's so much variation going on with the shadows, and that sometimes you hit like your darkest peak just before where the light is going to hit. So that's what we're simulating here by applying this airbrush on top of that. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It's a good place to start. I want to soften this up a little, so we can always grab our blur tool. Sorry. Oh, when you're doing that, just make sure to uncheck your lock transparencies, because then very little is going to change. I'm just going to soften that up a little bit. Just my brush size. Just to make sure the rendering just sells a little bit more. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so next what we're going to do is we've only been working on our shadows, adding some shading to this. So we're gonna switch gears and start worrying about adding light to the flats. So the way we're gonna do that is we're gonna create a new layer. We're gonna set to clip to layer, and then we're gonna change the blending mode to add glow. Awesome. We're gonna select, again, I already have my color swatches already here, so I'm going to select this tone. I'm going to switch to my airbrush tool, and I'm going to make sure it's set to soft. I'm going to increase the brush size to about 50, and with the layer set to add glow, what's going to happen is that when I apply my airbrush, you can see that it's having sort of this soft bloom effect to the shadows, or to the skin tone, sorry. And we're going to apply that to where that makes sense. Maybe a little bit here. And then the more that pressure you add to those areas, the more brush strokes you add to it, the more intense that highlight's going to be. So you're just going to have to play around and find what works for your illustration. You can use the eraser to transparency swatch again to sort of shape that and sculpt it a little bit to make it work the way you want to work. So again, this just goes back to being able to just studying shapes, studying your shadows, studying rendering, so you can understand how to apply those decisions or make those decisions as you're going through your shading process. Okay, so that looks good. Next, we've applied a little bit of this soft highlight to the skin area, what we want to do is we want to add some harsher highlights. So we're going to go back to our layer panels. We're going to create a new layer. We don't need to apply any blending modes or clip modes or clip to layers. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to move this layer above our inks. I'm going to show you why in just a moment. We're going to grab our brush and make sure it's a hard edge brush. Set the brush size to something fairly small that's reasonable within our working area. And what we're going to do is we're going to start adding some hard highlights, some specular highlights to our illustration. So again, I advise you guys to study. So let's make sure we have that selected. Make sure you guys study some photography, some other illustrations, and sort of understand where different artists put their highlights. For me, some surprising areas where you see these kind of highlights pop up is at the corners of the noses, where it meets the planes of the face and the cheek. The light seems to pool there. It's at the top of the lips. I've always also noticed that light seems to catch there. The bottom lip for sure. And then we want to apply some light here. So you can see we are drawing on top of the ink layer, and that's because we want to show there's that these highlights are really hitting or really intense over the illustration. So by doing it on top of the ink layer, kind of sort of sell that idea just a little bit better. And then again, you can shape those by using the transparency option, sort of craft that so it makes sense. You can experiment with using as close to white, just to make that sell a little bit more. And again, just want to shape that with transparency. As you can see, it's really coming together once we added that. Now, there's a couple of things you can do at this stage. You can blur this, you can duplicate this and blur it on top of it. You can switch the blending modes if you want to experiment to see how it would react to the layers below. But that's essentially the entire method, being able to do the shadow layer as sort of cell shading, soften it up with some bounce lighting with the lasso tool to cut it out, blur the edges where it makes sense, add some darkest darks to it, apply some soft glow, and then finally added some hard highlights, and then essentially you get something like this. Okay, so at this stage what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to a time lapse and show the entire process as I'm coloring through it. Hopefully you guys will be able to see how I apply that same method to all the other aspects of the illustration. So let's take a look. here's the final illustration. What do you guys think? Overall, this technique is great. I can tell that my writing has a lot more contrast and depth to it without getting washed out. However, I don't feel it's that much more faster than my current process of working on fewer layers. What do you guys think? Is this a method you can see yourself doing? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep drawing.